questions to get the ball rolling, I suppose. I'll ask just Tessa first, probably, and then Camila. It's the same questions, and we'll just hear from your different perspectives. So just to start with you, Tessa, why did you get involved in climate litigation?
Thanks, Edwin, and thank you, Matthew and Clodagh and Helena, for organising this discussion. It's a real pleasure to be a part of it, and always happy to do what I can to support the fantastic work that you guys are doing in suing the Irish government. So, and actually Matthew's intro was pretty comprehensive. I'm not sure I've got much to add to that, but yeah, I will just say that I started the Climate Litigation Network with some of the lawyers who were working on Urgenda's case against the Dutch government in 2016. And it was really a result of the fact that I was working before that. I was living in northern Thailand, and I was working on behalf of the women's movement in Asia as a human rights lawyer and advocate. And as part of that, I was helping the process of the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Agenda, which, like the Paris Agreement, the UN and all governments of the world also adopted in 2015. And it was increasingly clear to me as 2015 unfolded that both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, while the aspirations that those agreements embodied are, you know, they're good, they're solid goals for us to be aiming towards, you know, whether that's a kind of 1.5 degree target in the Paris Agreement or goals on inequality and poverty reduction within the Sustainable Development Agenda. It was becoming increasingly clear that, like so many other international agreements, there just wasn't any teeth in those agreements. So it was easy enough for governments to adopt them and then go home and basically ignore the commitments that they'd made, which were, you know, ultimately really political commitments without much legal force behind them. And so in June 2015, I got wind of Urgenda's case against the Dutch government, which of course was an attempt to really hold a national government accountable for the decades of commitments it's been making to protect human rights at the international level, and also to address climate change under the UN climate change framework. And obviously when the Urgenda was successful in its initial hearing in 2015, and the District Court of The Hague rendered a favourable decision, it was, you know, front page news all over the world. And I just thought that it was exactly the kind of thing that we should be fully exploring. Namely, litigation is something that we should be, you know, really thinking hard about as a new accountability mechanism for all of the commitments that governments make and then seem to feel free to ignore once the relevant international summit is over. So yeah, I mean, I was living in Asia, where obviously the impacts of climate change are being felt first and more acutely than in many other parts of the world. So, you know, my organisation also worked on climate justice. So, you know, it was becoming increasingly clear to me. I also have family in Bangladesh, that it is, you know, the biggest systemic threat to the enjoyment of human rights that humanity faces. And so it just seemed to me like there was really nothing more important than trying to hold governments accountable in a meaningful way in their own countries, and Urgenda really did that. And so I basically cold called the Urgenda legal team and offered to quit my job and work with them to set up the Climate Litigation Network. And I joined Urgenda's legal team, and so from that point onwards I was also part of the team that successfully defended Urgenda's case at the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court level. And yeah, I mean, the rest is history, I guess.
Thanks, that's great. So litigation definitely as an accountability mechanism. Camila, I wanted to ask you if you could explore the same question. So why did you get involved with climate litigation?
It's hard to follow after Tessa, but I'll give it a go. So, you know, in college and even before that, when I was still a teenager and I learned about climate change, I was like deeply shocked. I thought this couldn't be real, this issue that is clearly putting everything we know and we love in danger, and we haven't solved it. It just seemed like a massive failure. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna study this thing and try to figure out why is it that we haven't sold it. And in university, I was engaged in like some activist efforts around divestment of the endowment, and I also was tracking the UN climate negotiations, and I was trying to understand all these different forums in which people are calling for climate action. And one of the things that really piqued my interest was litigation, but in the US you can only be a lawyer when you're in grad school. And so I'd heard of the Urgenda case and Juliana in the US, and I was really, really intrigued. And then when I moved to Colombia, which is where I'm originally from, after I finished undergrad, it became clear that we wanted to bring a case that was inspired in these international cases for Colombia. Colombia, as many other global south countries around the world, is incredibly vulnerable to climate impacts. Even if our contributions to CO2 emissions are not as high as some of the developed countries, A, we still have a responsibility to develop sustainably, and B, we can call for adaptation and other important measures if we're not also holding ourselves accountable to the kind of emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere. And so that's kind of what piqued my interest and why I ended up working on it. I had studied Colombian policy on climate change, and I was also very intrigued about why, as Tessa said, in UN and other international fora, it was incredibly ambitious in terms of climate change. It had very solid and almost progressive rhetoric as compared to other players in Latin America, especially compared to Venezuela, Bolivia at that point. And yet back home, oil and coal were first to exports. Obviously, we are deforesting the Amazon. And so for me, it was this puzzle, like trying to understand why is it that, we can put forth this international positions and not do the same back home. And so that's why I ended up being involved in the Dejusticia and the action that we eventually brought.
Great, thanks so much. So that's a great way to set the scene, I guess. And then the next question to both of you, and I guess we'll start again with Tessa, is what is your case about? So the cases that you've respectively brought in, we'll focus on Urgenda for Tessa, otherwise it might get a bit confusing. Maybe you can just tell us a bit more about the case and how this works, also for people that don't have a legal background. So that would be great. And maybe again, starting with you, Tessa.
Sure. So Urgenda's case was filed against the Dutch government in 2013. And it was filed by Urgenda as well as 886 Dutch residents. And they basically argued that the trajectory for the Netherlands' greenhouse gas emissions was such that if the Netherlands was allowed to emit as much as it was likely to emit in 2020, it would be contributing to dangerous levels of climate change in a way that would undermine the enjoyment of human rights that are legally protected in the Netherlands, and would also be a breach of the Dutch civil code, which effectively also requires people not to expose other parties to harm if they know that harm is coming and there are reasonable steps that they can take to avert it. So there were sort of two components to the claim, but they both essentially requested the same thing, which is that the Dutch government reduce the Netherlands' greenhouse gas emissions by at least 25% by 2020 compared to 1990 levels. And in 2015, as I mentioned, the District Court of The Hague agreed with Urgenda and ordered the government to reduce its emissions by 25% by 2020. And that decision was upheld by the Court of Appeal in 2018 and then by the Supreme Court of the Netherlands in 2019. So the Dutch government has now exhausted all of its avenues for appeal, and it's really up to the government now to take the steps that are necessary to implement the court's emissions reduction order by the end of the year. And I can say more about the fact that the government is doing that, which I think is a really important dimension of these cases. Is it's one thing to get a great judgment in court that legal academics go wild for and that spawns 1,000 PhD dissertations, but it's obviously what we as climate justice activists are actually most concerned about is whether or not it stops greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere. And Urgenda's case, I think, because of the way that The organisation was really strategic about building a broader public base of support for the case, and including, broader political support for its goals, has been really successful in actually changing climate policy in the Netherlands and in reducing the Netherlands' greenhouse gas emissions.
Super. Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Just one more thing that I'll add to that, which I think kind of underlines the significance of the case, is that the human rights that Urgenda argued were being violated by the Dutch government's actions are human rights that are protected in the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a convention that's been signed by every Council of Europe government. So effectively the same rights are being litigated in the Irish climate case, and are available, as a basis potentially for climate litigation in all 57 or whatever Council of Europe states.
Yeah, it's definitely been a great help for us, all the work that Urgenda has done in bringing our case. Camila, maybe you could share a bit more about your Colombian case.
Yes, happy to do that. So as I mentioned, Colombia is not a country that has massive greenhouse gas emissions, but they've been increasingly they have been increasing in recent decades, especially because of mining and other extractive industries, and the way in which our government has thought about development, which is not unique to Colombia. It's pretty pervasive across the global south and the global north. And so we were thinking about what is it that is really driving emissions in Colombia, and most of them come from deforestation and land use change. And so our case was brought in 2018 on behalf of 25 children and young plaintiffs, inspired very much like Julian in the US, against the national government for its failure to stop deforestation. And so we were arguing that under the Colombian constitution, the rights to life, health, water, and a healthy environment were being threatened by deforestation, both because deforestation contributes to climate change, and climate change has impacts, right? But also because deforestation in itself disturbs local ecosystems that eventually have an impact on people's lives as well. And so what we're saying is that on behalf of us and future generations, the way that Colombian government was allowing deforestation to happen was already threatening, all of our human rights. And we were also looking at international obligations that Colombia, as I mentioned, had signed or had been involved in. So in I think it was in the Cancun negotiations under the UN, it had promised to stop deforestation, or to reach, zero net deforestation by 2020. And obviously it was 2018 and we were off track. And so, we said to the court, essentially, not only are these rights protected under the Colombian constitution, but Colombia itself has, pursued these particular positions in international climate fora, and has contributed an NDC, or a nationally determined contribution, to the Paris Agreement, and therefore, has to be held accountable. And so we didn't think we were going to win. I think most of these cases, you think about them, you bring them, and then a lot of it is totally unpredictable, in both good and bad, I think, which is, I think, why we have to be so thoughtful about the kind of climate cases that we want to bring and why we want to bring them. But in particular, after we lost on procedural grounds in the first instance, and we won before the Supreme Court of Colombia, the court also, declared the Amazon forest subject of rights, which is something that we had not requested in our complaint. We had only talked about, again, the human rights violations that were occurring to the plaintiffs. And so that was an interesting, a really interesting thing that a judge did. And I think that's why it's so important too, to think about how judges and just the legal system in general is thinking about climate change. Is a very new issue. Many of them don't even necessarily understand how climate change works or what is climate. There's folks that still think it's like the ozone layer, and even though for us working in this field, it's like obvious, it's really not for many people. And so trying to explain that to a judge, and using the IPCC findings and the very own official data from the government saying these are, the climate impacts that Colombia is already suffering, especially in areas, in the coast, sea level rise. The way something that was kind of a fun fact that we learned, and I had no idea, is that actually deforestation in the Amazon impacts the entire water cycle in the country. It makes sense now that you say it out loud, because the Amazon is such a large and unique ecosystem, but it actually does. And so there was this entire theory about how what happens in the Amazon forest in Colombia affects all other regions. And so yeah, that's a little bit about the case.
Wow. So inspiring and interesting. And I was wondering, so you touched upon this a little bit when you were answering the question, but just about the impact that the case has had. So you said that the judge recognized the rights of the Amazon for the first time. Can you maybe just share a bit more about the impacts that you think it has had so far? Was that okay? Am I muted or no, right?
You froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to ask if you could, tell us a bit more about the impacts that it has had, the case. So you said that the judge recognized the rights of the Amazon for the first time. Maybe you could just share a bit more about the impacts.
That is a great question. And I will say it really depends how you look at it. And this is, I think the case in Colombia offers really particular lessons for especially litigation in the Global South and how we think about implementation. What Tessa said really resonates with me, which is this is great and exciting, and it is an important precedent, and I don't want to undermine like the victory there and the importance of it, because it is important. It is a legal court recognizing that climate change poses a threat, a real threat, and is already threatening the rights of the citizens of Colombia. But at the same time, this is a very complex issue, and so we knew that bringing a case in a country that is overcoming more than half a century of armed conflict was not going to be easy, and that it was not going to be fixed by one judgment. And so it's been really effective in terms of raising awareness about climate change and centering climate as an issue, I think, on the agenda, especially for our younger plaintiffs that have used it as an opportunity to talk in their schools and talk to their families and talk to their friends and really become, sort of like the voices on this issue. I think it especially after, the Future for Fridays movement really began gaining as much visibility. I think most of the younger plaintiffs really use that as another platform to talk about, the role of future generations in securing, a safe climate. At the same time, I think it's been able to put, a very concrete face to the issue of climate, which tends to be abstract for a lot of people. It's like, this is so systemic. How are we even going to tackle such a impossible challenge, which I think in itself is something that litigation and climate litigation is helpful with. But there have been limitations. I think when we look at the deforestation rates, it's been mixed. The government, last year they decreased, and the government said it was because they were implementing the judgment, but they failed to connect the dots, and they failed to actually say, these are the ways in which we are tackling deforestation, and this is why it's actually decreased. And so it seems, and the most recent data isn't clear yet, but it has shown many, we call them, they're like, I'm trying to translate this in my head, but it's like hotspots, deforestation hotspots, and the ones we've seen this year are worse than we've seen before. And so we think the data is not going to be positive on that front. And as I said, this is a very complex issue, right? Deforestation doesn't happen because people hate trees, right? It happens because there are like socioeconomic drivers, or there are particular economies located in the Amazon when people have no other choice but to, bring down the trees. And at the same time, there's immense mafias that have vested interest in the extraction, in mining, in cocaine production, and agribusiness. And so all of those things are really hard to dismantle. And we have what has traditionally been a really weak state and a really corrupt state. And so again, a judgment, I don't think it's going to solve all those underlying issues. So I would say the implementation is the biggest challenge that we have right now.
Thanks. Well, Tessa, you touched upon the fact that the Netherlands, the Dutch government, has not been the most cooperative either, appealing the decisions time after time, now exhausted all their options. But yeah, maybe you could also just shed a bit more light on the question, what has been the impact of the case?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it is important, I guess, to highlight in light of what Camila says, that it's not just countries in the global south, weak states or states with weak rule of law. It's not just those governments that will resist the implementation of ambitious judgments that require them to really do hard work in the short term. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the first decision in Urgenda's case in 2015, the Dutch government, and the Dutch Parliament, as a result of all of the media coverage of the case and, public support for the case, they implemented a number of measures that didn't relate to what they had to do in 2020, but related to what they had to do in 2030, for example. So they enacted a new Climate Change Act with, what was at the time a pretty ambitious emissions reduction target for 2030. They agreed to phase out coal-fired power as soon as possible. I mean, not to downplay how important those steps are and the fact that they wouldn't have happened without the case, but they did still allow the government to kind of kick the can down the road, and they didn't address what emissions of the Netherlands would be in 2020. So, while the government was appealing the case, because the Netherlands, is a country that is home to some of the most important international courts in the world, and they've got to at least show the public that they're a fan of the rule of law. They kept saying that they would implement the decision. But then it really wasn't until after the Supreme Court's decision in December 2019 that they actually started to take the steps that are necessary, in the course of a year now, to close a pretty big emissions reduction gap that was still outstanding. And Urgenda, I'm confident in saying that they also wouldn't have done that had Urgenda not been so strategic in building the political and social pressure that was necessary for the government to do that. So Urgenda, for example, worked together with, it convened 800 organisations and businesses to come up with a 54-point plan, basically, 54 different measures that the government could take that were all pretty affordable, that would contribute to the closing of the emissions reduction gap. And that, that 54-point plan ended up being endorsed in Parliament, and there are a number of resolutions adopted by the Dutch Parliament by other parties, asking the government for more transparency about what it was doing to implement the court's order. And that, again, was really because Urgenda made a very deliberate decision to make it clear that it wasn't just the initiative of some niche environmental organisation. This was something that had broad public support, and that a lot of different sectors of society and industry had a stake in. And I think that's, it's a really rare example, actually, of strategic litigation that's had a really ambitious outcome that has resulted in real change on the ground. Like, we really can't take for granted that that's going to happen just because you get a good judgment. So, as a human rights lawyer, I can tell you that human rights, the human rights movement is just littered with examples of great decisions in courts around, everything from desegregation of education to the right to housing, to right to food. And obviously those are important from a legal perspective, but so often nothing changes because it really does, go to the heart of so many of the decisions that governments have to make around how they distribute resources and so on. And so there really is a need for a kind of clever and concerted campaign and communication strategy around a case that a government doesn't feel like it can get away with ignoring these decisions. And I think that's why, what you guys are doing with Climate Case Island is so important in terms of building that broader public support to show that the government, that it'll be held accountable. Really, there will be public accountability for what it does in the aftermath of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa, that's great. And yeah, that's definitely what we're trying to do with the case, just changing the narrative and building pressure, just with the case as such being only one part of that broader bigger picture. We'll now move on to asking, well, basically moving on to getting the audience to ask questions. So Clodagh, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Tessa and Camila. That was just fantastic. So we have two questions here. The first one from Niamh Cotter. This is a quick question for Tessa. How would you respond to fears that the Urgenda case could lead to states being reluctant to agree specific reduction targets in a bid to avoid future litigation? It's a very good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. So I guess, you know, my response really to that is that it's the targets that governments have set themselves aren't in themselves a sufficient basis for these cases. Like, nothing governments do can get them out of the fact that they have human rights obligations to their residents, and that if they are contributing to harm that will undermine the enjoyment of those human rights, there is accountability under, for example, human rights law or constitutional rights law, as in, you know, as in Climate Case Ireland. And, you know, it's really about the actions that governments are taking and not just what they've committed to on paper. I mean, in Urgenda's case, they weren't trying to in any way directly enforce targets that governments have agreed to at an international level. And in fact, you know, the Dutch government didn't have a target that it had set itself for 2020. It was just clear that that's the kind of trajectory that its emissions were on, that was what was in fact what Urgenda was challenging. So, you know, basically, as long as the facts demonstrate that governments are being negligent and aren't doing enough to protect their, you know, the people who live within their country, the people that they have jurisdiction over, then that'll be enough, you know, to really build a basis for these cases.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Tessa. And then we have another question here from Laura Burgers towards Camila. She says, thanks a lot for this webinar. I enjoyed it a lot. And to Camila, how has the decision about the Amazon, in particular the notion of rights of nature, been received by the general public?
Thank you, Laura, for your question. It's very positively for the most part. I think it resonates with people. This idea that, well, not with everyone, but with a lot of people, this idea that nature in itself should be valued for nature's sake, and that there should be some legal protection that's given to it outside of, you know, traditional human rights. And I think, you know, the Amazon case was not the first in Colombia to do this. It actually was building on like a prior case in 2016 that granted the Atrato River the same legal status. And that case is particularly interesting because the river is also not just, you know, important for its ecosystem services or anything like that, but it's at the center of Afro-Colombian communities that depend on it for its livelihood. And so the sentence was actually, the judgment was actually not just about the river, but about how, you know, the interaction that communities have with the river and the traditional human rights and their, you know, their livelihoods depend on the river, and why therefore the river should also be subject of special protection. I think the you know, the judgment has a special way of talking about it, like restoration, conservation, preservation, etc. But in terms of what's happened after, it's that it's really inspired other judges, and this is why I think it's so important to think about, you know, judges and other people, you know, who are not experts on climate change, because it's really inspired them to then declare other rivers in Colombia subject of rights. And I think at this point it's only been rivers, but, you know, this idea of rights of nature has also been expanded in Colombia to, I think, a bear that was in captivity at one point. And obviously it's been used internationally in New Zealand and many other places. So I think it's, again, a really exciting opportunity and a really exciting space to think about how we can bring more like, you know, justice and accountability on all sorts of rights, not just human rights. But again, I think we have to be careful that, you know, it's not enough for a court to just say that this particular forest or ecosystem is now subject of legal protection.
Thank you, Camila. We have a question from Patrick Paul Walsh. He says, how do we map current inaction or 2 to 5 to 10 more years of inaction and the damage to human rights within nations? Is the science good on what pathways are feasible or not? This is kind of a big question. When do we run out of time? And can governments not say we will do it in a minute to a year to 2050? So either of you or both of you can take that if you like.
I'll take a crack at least part of that question.
Great.
So, you know, as far as governments kind of continually deferring emissions reduction, the really great thing about the report that the IPCC published in 2018, which got, you know, loads of coverage, which was on basically the implications of 1.5 degrees of warming, which is 0.4 of a degree more than where we currently are, is that report, which is, you know, about as authoritative as any research paper can get. It's, you know, a review of thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers. And it concluded that in order to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, governments have to, or globally, we have to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. And in 2018, when that report was published, global emissions annually were rising. So they weren't not dropping at a fast enough rate to meet the 45% target. They were going in the opposite direction entirely. And a country like Ireland, we know, is also going in entirely the opposite direction. So that, you know, that I think, you know, part of the reason that report resonated so much was because it did give a pretty hard timeline to what governments have to do in, you know, now it's only 10 years, it was 12 years at the time. And that, you know, that kind of level of emissions reductions that is necessary is getting steeper and steeper as each year passes and governments fail to do what's necessary. But 1.5 degrees, I think it's also important to say, isn't some kind of, you know, hard guardrail where if we blow it, which, you know, on current kind of projections, we are likely to burn past 1.5 degrees in rapid order. It doesn't mean that we then just throw our hands up because we failed to, you know, address the climate crisis. After that, every single fraction of a degree still matters. Every fraction of a degree means more suffering, more displacement, more extreme weather, you know, more loss of life around the world. So there's absolutely no excuse to give up just because we haven't hit the 1.5 degree target. I think there's a great quote by a climate scientist, Kate Marvel, who, you know, said climate change isn't a cliff we fall off, it's a slope we slide down, you know, and there's always time to kind of arrest that slide. And if we continue to let emissions keep rising, then, you know, then that slide down the kind of cliff face is going to get increasingly worse. So, you know, there's really never any reason to stop agitating for governments to do more.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We have another question here for Tessa from Patricia Devlin. She says, Tessa, what is the Netherlands government doing to promote or support alternative energy generation?
Well, the most important thing, I mean, ironically, even though the Netherlands, I think people associate with like windmills and bicycles, has one of the worst or the lowest mixes of renewable energy in its electricity generation mix of any European country. And so as a result of the decision in Urgenda's case, as a part of the package of measures that the government announced just last month to implement the 25% reduction order, the government has agreed to reduce the capacity of 3 coal-fired power plants by 75%. And those coal-fired power plants were only opened in 2015. So, you know, there's really no bang for your buck in opening coal-fired power plants in the Netherlands anymore. So the first step towards more renewable energy generation is, of course, to shut down the current supply of fossil fuel-based energy generation. And then beyond that, the government has got plans to invest a lot more in onshore and offshore wind power, although in the short term, it's planning to invest in a lot more biomass, which we know is actually also not an unproblematic fuel to be replacing fossil fuels with. So yeah, so it's not over yet, but there are kind of steps being taken in the right direction. The most important step, of course, being shutting down fossil fuel supply.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Jessica Miranda, who says, are there any challenges or limitations to using a rights-based approach to climate change? And I'll put that to both of you if you're both okay with that. Maybe we'll start with you, Camila, if you like.
Happy to start. This is the $1,000,000 question. No, but I mean, it's a really important question because I think, you know, there's an entire field of scholarship on this, but I think rights, at least to me, are only as useful as we think they are and as we enforce them to be, right? And so they've provided an incredible tool for climate litigation because the people who were doing climate before, at least to me, had framed it in a different way. The narratives were about emissions, on hockey sticks, and IPCC science, and all really important things, right? We know that the science is what leads us here, and it's what we need to affect change and to actually tackle the climate crisis. But those narratives are not winning hearts and minds and the, you know, across the world. And I think rights have allowed us to do that. Not only have they given us a cause of action and their particular legal system to say you are threatening or violating my right, which is what these cases are saying, but they've allowed us to create a narrative, you know, built on reality about how climate change is threatening everything about our existence. And I think putting that face, that human face, those stories is so important when we're thinking about tackling the greatest challenge that we've ever faced as humanity. And again, I think it talks about who are the people that are being impacted. You know, in our case, it was youth and future generations, which is one of the many stakeholders that are impacted by climate injustice. And, you know, increasingly we're seeing cases where, you know, the people that are most affected or that are disproportionately affected by climate change, which is, you know, traditionally, you know, people of color, low-income people, communities, low-income communities, marginalized communities, you know, particular people in the global South, indigenous folks. So anyways, we're starting to see how rights are providing a tool for us to share those stories and kind of translate those stories in a way that's cognizable for a court. And again, I think they build the larger public narrative and media piece that's also hugely important, even more important than the litigation at times, because it allows us to talk about it and to, you know, again, put a face to who is driving the climate crisis. Who are the companies that are driving the climate crisis? It's not a coincidence. It's not just happening. Which are the governments that haven't, you know, that have been negligent and have not, you know, protected the rights that they're supposed to. So I think it's very useful, but I agree that it has limitations depending on how you're using it and the context.
Okay, that's a fantastic answer. And over to you, Tessa.
I agree with everything that Camila said. I think the only thing, I guess the only thing that I would add is just that, you know, human rights are different from other kind of legal frameworks because they're so focused on us as rights holders, right? Which is a really empowering kind of frame. It's clearly establishes that states and, you know, companies are duty bearers and they owe legal duties to us. And that, I think, is a really important shift in the kind of locus of responsibility in the context of climate change, because part of the reason that, you know, people get quite stressed about discussions about climate change is because they think that they're responsible or they're not doing enough. And what, you know, what the human rights framework makes really clear is that actually, you know, there are bodies that have power in our societies that have assumed these responsibilities that owe duties to us, that we rely on to fulfill those duties, which, you know, which would protect our human rights. So I think that's a, you know, really useful dimension of the framework. And then beyond that, I think it's not really well designed, and nor is any legal framework for climate change as a problem, because it's such a tough nut to crack as a problem. And one of the issues is that, you know, human rights law has traditionally been applied to human rights violations after they've occurred. And what we're trying to do with climate change, of course, is it's way too late if we only start to rely on the law after the worst impacts have started to hit. So we're basically asking courts to say governments have to act when the risk arises, not after the harm happens. And that's somewhere that human rights law is a little less comfortable. But helpfully, it's somewhere that international environmental law is much more comfortable. So, you know, there are principles like the precautionary principle under international environmental law that require governments to take action to reduce risks, even if there's scientific uncertainty about the nature of that risk and exactly when the harm will materialize. So what Urgenda did And, you know, what Climate Case Island we hope will do is bring those two sets of principles together so that you end up with the really kind of robust defense of people's rights that the human rights framework offers, with the understanding of the kind of complexity of environmental threats that the environmental framework offers.
Thank you so much. I just have one question for both of you. What gives you hope for the future?
Camila, I'd like to volunteer you to answer that question.
I was going to volunteer you, Tessa. No, but we were actually talking about this before the webinar started. And, you know, right now, even though climate's always at the forefront of my mind, what I'm thinking about, because of what's going on in the US, is racial justice. And for some folks, it's a totally different fight, and it's disconnected, and it has nothing to do with climate. And if you're one of those folks, I think you're wrong, and we should talk about it. No, but really, I think social movements give me hope, because lawyers, as important as we think we are, I'm not a lawyer yet, disclaimer, but hopefully I'll be, as they think they are, it's really not about us. It's not about, you know, it's not about lawyers, it's not about courts, it's not about fancy judgments. It's about people on the ground claiming their rights and enforcing those rights. And so what's happening in the US right now, even though it's distressing in many ways, it also gives me a lot of hope, because I think we are, you know, unlike Fridays for Future, unlike the youth movement, and like just the social unrest we see in the world right now, even though it's stressful, I think it signals something bigger, and it signals that people are awake, and people know something's not right, you know, whether that's you know, fossil fuel companies continue to act like they have a social license to destroy the planet, or, you know, police brutality in the streets. And so for me, many of those fights are interconnected, and to me, seeing people, you know, not give hope and fight is what gives me hope to fight as well.
Yeah, so I emphatically endorse everything that Camila's just said and adopt it all as my own remarks. But I guess in addition to that, I would add that, well, two things really. The first is that I think that hope is kind of overrated, to be honest, in the context of this fight, because if you're looking at the science every day and, you know, the growing gap between where we need to be and where we are, and, you know, the fact that, like, you know, as Bill McKibben says, you know, winning this fight slowly is the same as losing, right? So it's not really good enough that there are a few signs of progress, that the price of renewable energy is dropping, etc., for as long as we're still pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the rate that we are. So, so in the face of those very kind of hard, incontrovertible facts, it is difficult to be hopeful, because there's nothing in the history of our experience with climate change so far that suggests that we're suddenly going to be capable of the unprecedented transformation of our economic and industrial systems to, you know, to basically do what we know is necessary. But yeah, but that's why I say that hope is overrated, because there are so many other emotions that can motivate action, you know, and that is outrage, indignation, just a sense that it is unfair and unjust that we're allowing this to happen, and that a certain group of, a tiny minority of people are profiting from the problem, and the rest of us are having to deal with its impacts. You know, those for me are very powerful motivators, and that's enough to kind of get me out of bed in the morning and keep working on this. And of course, you know, I guess the other thing is that being in the fight also creates hope, right? It's like action generates hope. And so the more you do it, the more you feel sustained and the more, you know, the more you realize there are other people doing the same thing, the more regenerative that feeling is. But, you know, in terms of, and I really don't think that there is any precedent for the scale of transformation and the speed of the transformation that we need to, for example, meet 1.5 degrees of warming. So you can't really look for historical precedents that give you a sense that we can do this. But there are other historical precedents of massive kind of moments of social transformation: the end of slavery, the end of, you know, segregation in the US, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the end of apartheid, whatever. And in all of those fights, you know, things looked really, really bad for a really long time. And there was no suggestion at all that things were going to change. And when things did start to change, it was met with huge amounts of resistance by the powers that were profiting from the system as it was. And, you know, power never surrenders or makes concessions easily. So I think that's what we're up for. But that, you know, the fact then that things are hard and are going to get harder isn't necessarily a sign that we won't win ultimately.
Very powerfully said. Thank you so much, both of you. We have one more question here. Grace Wells says, I'm wondering if Tessa could speak a little about her awareness of the climate issues in Bangladesh.
Sure. So I guess, you know, I am aware of the issues on kind of two levels. One is in my capacity as a climate change lawyer. You know, Bangladesh is often cited as the country that will experience the greatest levels of internal displacement and ultimately forced migration, because it's one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and it's also among the lowest lying. So, you know, when people talk about climate refugees, they often point to Bangladesh as an example of a country that will be a source of tens of millions of people who are forced to leave their homes because of climate change. So on a kind of academic level, I feel like Bangladesh is kind of a postcard for vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And it's, I think, you know, technically within the sort of top 10 or 15 countries in terms of its vulnerability. But yeah, on a personal level, as I said, all of my extended family is still in Bangladesh, and I am there often. And you know, one of the things that climate change is already doing to Bangladesh is driving massive amounts of migration from rural areas to the cities, because it's no longer possible to make a living farming or, you know, through small scale agriculture in areas that are now slowly being inundated by salt water. And it's harder and harder to get fresh drinking water supplies, again, because of saltwater inundation. And of course, increasingly frequent and intense tropical storms like Cyclone Amphan, which happened last month, which was the fiercest storm to ever occur in the Bay of Bengal. So that is driving people out of the rural parts of Bangladesh into the already massively overcrowded cities. And you can tell when you're in those cities that they aren't, it's not sustainable. The infrastructure doesn't exist. People are living in ways that are increasingly desperate, and those are very visible impacts.
Thank you so much for that answer there, Tessa. It's just coming up to 6 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap it up now. I just want to say a big thank you, first of all, to Tessa and Camila. I think you have spoke fantastically, and I think all the audience members really enjoyed it. So thanks for taking the time out and coming to talk to us today. There's just a few points that I want to make to the audience before we end. First of all, we're going to put some links in the chat box now to websites and Twitter accounts of our two speakers, if you want to follow them and keep up to date with everything they're up to. And then the other thing is that we have another talk this day next week. It's on Instagram, so it's over on Patagonia Dublin's Instagram page. It's going to be a live talk from Climate Case Ireland, getting everyone up to date on what's going on and what's going to happen in the case on the 22nd and 23rd of this month. And then lastly, the petition has been shared a few times in the chat box now, so if you haven't signed it already, please do. And of course, feel free to share it among your friends and family as well. So I think that's everything. So I just want to say thanks to the audience for the questions, and thanks again to the two speakers for speaking so well to us this evening. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. And I feel like it was a bit of a bummer of a note to end on. So I just want to say that we're really excited about the Supreme Court hearing on the 22nd and the 23rd, and really inspired by everything you guys are doing. So good luck.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for everyone for your really insightful questions and for contributing to such a rich discussion. And thank you so much to Camila and Tessa. I feel that we've learned so much from your insights, and it's just been so inspiring. I feel really fired up now for our hearing in less than 2 weeks. So yeah, that's the 22nd and the 23rd. We're going to be in the Supreme Court. So sign and share that petition and follow Tessa and Camila. You can see their links in the Twitter chat now. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.